Hi, my name is Jason T. Ingram, and I had 12 years of Bible based born again Christianity after having grown up in a very hypersexualized, progressive, educated community. And I was introduced to, right wing political views and culture as an outsider, and I was able to appreciate a lot of that, and I still do. I love these people. They're absolutely wonderful, hardworking, dedicated, honorable people, for the most part, and I love to be around them. And as much as I have a tendency to get into arguments with them, which is kind of funny, even when I'm agreeing with them, they just assume I'm arguing with them because my views are so different. But it's so funny that one of the main things that I observe when it comes to the political and religious divide, especially in Western culture and here in America, is this whole thing about sex and violence. And it is really weird how one group thinks one is okay and the other isn't, and vice versa. Now, it's not to say that folks on the political and religious right think sex is bad. No, no. It's just that they're not so hypersexualized as the last 50 years we've had youth culture from the 60s pretty much take over pop culture, which was very hypersexualized. And we've had a hypersexualized mainstream media, and that seems to be okay when it comes to mainstream media, which has been influenced by a lot of progressive ideas, a lot of progressive politics and religion, and the whole free love thing, and the whole anti-violence, anti-war thing is that too. So I grew up with violence is bad, sex is good. In fact, sex is so good that, get a lot of it and talk about it a lot and talk about it to little kids because, we have to make it normal, have to make sex just normal, like it's just an everyday thing, sex, 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 talk about it, have it all over the place. I mean, it might not have been that extreme, but I mean, compared to my parents' generation, my generation was very hypersexualized, and it was a reaction towards the repressed life that they grew up in, of folks that believed that just touching yourself was wrong, and you had to just be a monogamous your whole life with one person that was of the opposite sex. I mean, it was very limiting, and they were reacting against that, and I grew up with that reaction, not really knowing what it came from originally. And then what happens is that there was this whole passive aggressive type thing because of the nonviolent stance. So it's like, okay, aggression is bad, anger is bad, especially if you're a man. You can't express anger in my culture that I grew up in. And so there was this hyper, like, okay, be passive, be a war resistor, a conscientious objector kind of a thing. And then I get along the Christian stuff. And it was definitely like, they don't advocate for violent acts, at least not very often. But you also notice that these are the folks that want to advocate for firearms and things like that. But here's the crazy part. That when it comes to what we call the religious right, which I was in for 12 years, is that I'm just giving movies as an example, and I have a story that I touched on earlier in my series that I think is just really epitomizes this whole thing. Is that I was living with this guy, like I said, he had like a dozen brothers and sisters. He was a really good guy. He was about my age, and we were both young adult bachelors and stuff, and I was renting a room in his little house. And I remember I came home one day and he was watching a movie. It was like one of those Fast and Furious kind of action movies, or I think it was a John Woo movie. For some reason, he liked John Woo. I think that's his name, anyways. And he also had the whole X-Men series, and there was a lot of action and just a lot of fighting and that kind of stuff. And that was okay, as long as there wasn't any fucking or any nudity, then that was okay. It didn't matter how violent it was. So anyways, I walked in one time and I walked by the living room and he's watching a movie of this guy being skinned alive. And I got mad. I got offended. I said, that is really gross. Could you either turn that off or just, I don't want to be in the house in that. And then he's like, hey, this is a John Woo movie or something. It's really cool. All it is just, whatever. And he was just like, it wasn't a big deal to him. It was absolutely disgusting to me. I don't think they actually showed it, but they were like about to do something really grotesque and violent to some character who was being held captive or something. And then I was watching this movie called A Beautiful Mind. And most of us know about the movie A Beautiful Mind, which had to do with a mathematician, scientist, geek that was mentally ill and that kind of stuff too. And one of his big concepts he came up with was challenging a 19th century established fundamental principle of economics, of this whole thing about everybody being competitive, and it seems to make the economics go all magically wonderful and it's all good, and that's what we believed for a long time. And then I think his name was John Nash, and he's in a bar, and I don't know if this is the exact story about how it happened, but the way they portrayed it in the movie is the Russell Crowe character. He's talking to his buddies about getting laid, and there's these women that walk in, and it's actually kind of a funny scene. It has really nothing to do with sex. In fact, they don't even show sex in it. They just made a reference to it that, well, if we all go for the brunette and not the blonde, then we all get to score. But if we all went for the blonde and blah blah blah, and he goes in this. So he says, well, it's not just competition, but it also has to be a cooperative thing and stuff like that. And so, anyways, the church guy that ran the house, he walked in right during that scene. That's the only scene that he saw from A Beautiful Mind, not knowing what the movie was about or even what the title was. And he just thought it was a movie like American Pie, which is about like getting laid. Hey, let's get laid and let's have a whole movie about trying to get laid and whatever and stuff like that. But he had an aversion to that scene, and there wasn't any nudity or anything like that, just a reference to that. And he really got on my case about how evil that was. So I'm just saying that just because I have existed in these two extreme cultures in my life, and it is really weird how one is like sexual freedom big time, and then the other one is like, for instance, you can't watch a rated R movie unless it's The Passion of the Christ. Another one, which is funny, is when I was in straight camp, they love the Lord of the Rings series, and those are really bloody and gory and violent, and but anyways, I think that's kind of a crazy thing, because here's the thing, is that we don't need aggression, we don't need violence in order to sustain all of humanity. It is not essential. What we do need is, we need to keep making babies or we're going to die off. And we can't make babies unless we have sex, unless we all believe in artificial insemination. But at the same time, too, that sex is great for intimacy, it's great physically, psychologically, and it can be done in a lot of different contexts as long as it's not exposing yourself or others to a lot of diseases and a lot of heartache, and basically throwing your energy and your intimacy around randomly, which I've done before, and it's harmful. I've had a lot of harmful sexual behavior, and I've had a lot of helpful behavior in my life. And I've had times where I've had a healthy sex life that I don't think was really harming myself. It did harm my faith for a while, and I had to reconcile that. But one of the craziest things, I mean, in addition to like being compartmentalized or hearing voices or letting people trample all over you or having it's having an over amount of aggression and being okay with seeing aggressive things, with seeing gore and killing, and saying, well, we don't want to expose ourselves to a lot of violent movies. However, when you get around a lot of people of faith, they would rather watch a movie that has explicit violence in it, like war movies and battle movies and stuff like that, than movies that are like a romantic comedy that might show some boobs or might have a bed scene. And I personally think, from my perspective, it is crazy to choose one over the other. if you were to choose a movie that had explicit sex scenes in it, or a movie that had explicit violent scenes in it. And for me, I can't watch violence anymore. I watched a lot of violent movies. I grew up with violent movies, and I don't like them anymore. I watch a lot of documentaries, and I'm on Curiosity Stream, and sometimes they'll show these documentaries from Europe, and sometimes they'll show some nudity, and I've been around a lot of nudist clubs and stuff like that, and I just don't think nudity in itself is evil, and I don't even think that people that might even have an open relationship, if it's healthy and doesn't harm anybody, which is very difficult to maintain an open relationship and for people not to get hurt. But I think it's possible for people to do that. But like I said, it's very difficult. But when it comes to sex before marriage, I think that is really a lot to ask people to wait until they're married to be sexually intimate. And that's another form of crazy. And another thing, especially when it comes to my life, is what kind of gender I love. And that is another form of crazy, of thinking that if I am meant to love somebody of the same gender, and that's natural to me, that for someone to say that I have to change that, no matter how harmful it is, then that's another form of crazy. And then they'll show movies on the screen of blood and killing and violence and Bible stories that have that as well, and saying, well, we don't necessarily advocate violence, but it's okay to show this. It's okay to show this in a chapel. And therefore, basically what they're saying is that, for lack of a better term, if you had to choose sex or violence, they would rather choose violence in a lot of contexts when it comes to movies. And then they express that because a lot of these folks advocate a lot of aggressive behavior and a lot of abuse. And I've seen it, and I've been a victim of that many times. And when it comes to sexuality, a lot of Christians are hypersexual, but they compartmentalize it and they keep it a secret. They have a secret sex life, and they feel like it's the only way they can express their sexuality is in secret. And I'm talking about, the Trinity Broadcasting type mentality of, going to Promise Keepers and going to sexual addiction recovery groups and all this kind of stuff. I mean, to the point, when I've seen guys talk about having a rubber band around their wrist, and every time they are attracted to a woman or a man or something, that they hurt themselves and they snap that rubber band, and it's like flagellating themselves, like in the Dark Ages or something like that, just because they had a sexual thought, whether they acted on it or not. And to live that life, you can only keep that up for so long, and that's a whole nother form of crazy. I lived in that type of world for 12 years, and then the last 5 of those years, it was in this thing where I felt like the only thing to do was to go to these sexual addiction groups, because that's what they told me I was. And their practices weren't just about snapping rubber bands on your wrist. That was just one of them. But a lot of these things, in order to get people to go against their sexual desires, instead of creating a healthy context for it, they create some very psychologically harmful behaviors and tactics. And they change every year or so because they don't work. And that will make people really fucking crazy, especially men. And it's no wonder why they feel like they have no choice but to live a secret life and to lie about it, because they have a lot to lose if they were to be open about their sexual behavior.